bad.
Okay, this is bad. So what do you want to do? Look, good, it's bad. Good.
Why are you yelling at me? And I need to know that she gonna be there for me because I just sacrificed my family for the woman I love. And she's screaming at me. That is not acceptable.
Jenny had already survived the kind of secret most marriages never recover from. So learning years later about another major decision made without her knowledge hit a nerve deeper than money. When a relationship has already been tested by hidden truths, every new surprise carries the weight of everything forgiven before, and Jenny suddenly faced an uncomfortable question about how many times love should be asked to absorb the same kind of hurt. Longtime viewers know why secrecy lands differently with Jenny and Sumit. Early in their relationship, Jenny believed she understood the man she had crossed continents to be with, only for her entire picture of their future to collapse when she learned Sumit was married to another woman. His wife's father arrived. The truth came crashing into Jenny's life, and a relationship already filled with complications became something far more painful because one of the biggest facts had been kept from her. The former wife does not need to become the villain in this story because the emotional issue sits somewhere else entirely. Sumit knew information capable of changing Jenny's choices, yet Jenny learned the truth after investing her trust, time, and future in him. Her reaction mattered because betrayal often hurts most when the person affected realizes they were making decisions with only part of the story. Jenny still stayed emotionally connected to Sumit, even after learning about the marriage, and this is where their history becomes harder to reduce to one simple judgment. Sumit eventually moved forward with divorce proceedings. His divorce became final, and Jenny chose to continue building a life with him despite everything she had already endured. For some viewers, her decision proved how deeply she loved him. For others, the same decision raised another question, because forgiveness only repairs a relationship when the behavior behind the hurt changes with it. Jenny had already offered one enormous second chance, so years later, another undisclosed decision was never going to feel like an isolated mistake. Their path toward marriage brought more uncertainty. Sumit struggled with the pressure surrounding marriage paperwork, while opposition from his family kept hanging over the relationship. Jenny spent years waiting for decisions, dealing with legal obstacles, worrying about her future in India, and trying to understand whether Sumit would fully choose the life they kept discussing together. At times, their story felt almost absurd in how many obstacles one couple managed to collect. Lawyers entered the picture. Documents became major plot points. Family approval turned into an ongoing battle, and immigration concerns sat beside relationship problems as if one source of stress was never enough. Jenny kept moving through each crisis because she believed reaching the other side would finally bring stability. Eventually, Jenny and Sumit married, and after so many delays, objections, and emotional setbacks, the wedding seemed like the moment when uncertainty might finally lose its grip on them. Yet marriage did not erase the history preceding it, because trust does not reset simply because paperwork changes. Their relationship had survived hidden information before, but survival never answered the harder question about whether the pattern itself had changed. Then money brought the issue back into focus. Jenny believed they were dealing with financial problems together, only to learn Sumit had taken out thousands of dollars in loans without telling her first. The amount mattered, especially when finances were already creating stress, but the emotional impact reached beyond numbers because Jenny had once again found herself learning about a major decision after Sumit had already made it. For Jenny, this was no longer only about debt. Years earlier, she discovered a hidden marriage after building a future around incomplete information, and now another serious part of their shared life had been handled without full disclosure. She had forgiven the biggest secret once, stayed through the fallout, survived the divorce process, faced family resistance, waded through uncertainty, and still chose Sumit. So, when another hidden decision entered their marriage years later, the question became harder to ignore. Was Jenny looking at a new problem, or was an old wound proving it had never fully closed? By this point, Jenny's anger was never going to stay confined to a number on a loan statement, because money only explained the newest argument while secrecy explained why the argument cut so deeply. Sumit's former marriage had ended years earlier, yet the habit of revealing major decisions late kept pulling old memories back into a relationship Jenny had spent years trying to protect. Their history already gave viewers 3 separate moments to compare, without pretending each one carried the same weight. Sumit first entered Jenny's life through catfishing, which meant their connection began with an identity he had not presented honestly. Later, Jenny learned he had entered an arranged marriage while continuing his relationship with her, and years after surviving the fallout from both of those chapters, she learned Sumit had taken roughly $15,000 to $20,000 in loans without telling her. The latest problem looked financial on the surface, but Jenny's reaction made more sense when viewed through everything behind it. She was not hearing only a debt figure, she was hearing another example of information arriving after the decision had already been made. Once a spouse has lived through one enormous hidden truth, even a different kind of secret starts carrying familiar emotional weight, because the mind does not separate history as neatly as paperwork does. Sumit still deserves a fair reading because many of his choices have unfolded under intense family pressure rather than inside a simple 2-person marriage. His parents opposed the relationship for years, and he repeatedly found himself caught between the woman he chose and the family whose approval still mattered deeply to him. Their current problems have again placed family involvement close to the center, which helps explain why Sumit often seems to make decisions while trying to satisfy several competing obligations at once. Explanation, though, does not erase responsibility between spouses. Feeling pressure from parents, money, or family expectations does not remove the need to tell your partner when thousands of dollars in debt enter a shared future. Jenny did not need every problem solved before hearing about it, but she did need the chance to understand what was happening while choices affecting both of them were still being made. This is where the story stops feeling like ordinary reality television chaos and starts feeling painfully familiar. Jenny has invested years of her life in Sumit, moved across countries, faced immigration uncertainty, absorbed family rejection, waded through legal complications, and defended a relationship many people expected to fail. Leaving after so much history would never feel like walking away from one argument, because she would also be confronting every sacrifice she made while believing those sacrifices were leading towards something more stable. Loyalty looks admirable when 2 people keep choosing each other through hardship, yet loyalty becomes harder to celebrate when the same boundary keeps getting tested. Jenny staying through earlier betrayals proved commitment, but commitment does not mean she loses the right to expect different behavior later. Sumit earning forgiveness, once also, does not turn forgiveness into a permanent pass for future secrecy. If divorce ever entered Jenny's mind, the emotional case would not rest on a former marriage already ended long ago. The deeper issue would be whether the pattern behind those old wounds had ever disappeared, because hidden identity, hidden marriage, and hidden debt all raise one uncomfortable concern, even though the circumstances differ. Jenny has spent years proving she was willing to stay. The question now is whether Sumit has fully learned what staying requires from him, because the newest financial revelation has reopened a trust problem whose consequences are still unfolding. By the time viewers reached this point in Jenny and Sumit's story, the argument had become bigger than one financial revelation, because everyone watching brought years of history into the same room with them. Some fans looked at the undisclosed loans and immediately saw another example of Sumit making a major decision first and explaining the consequences later, while others saw a complicated marriage where 2 people had already survived problems far worse than debt and still seemed deeply attached to each other. That divide matters because Jenny and Sumit have never inspired one simple reaction from the audience. Some viewers remain skeptical of Sumit whenever financial explanations become complicated, especially after watching Jenny learn important information late more than once during their relationship. Those viewers remember the catfishing, the arranged marriage revelation, the hesitation around marriage paperwork, and now the loans, so their concern is less about one isolated mistake and more about whether transparency keeps arriving only after Jenny has already been affected. Other viewers read the same relationship from almost the opposite direction because they see a couple who stayed together when nearly every external pressure told them to separate. Jenny moved to India. Sumit faced years of resistance from his parents. Their age difference became a constant source of criticism. Legal complications followed them. marriage plans stalled, and family acceptance remained painfully difficult. After all of that, they still married and continued choosing a shared life, which makes some fans believe their connection carries more substance than the chaos surrounding it. If you were Jenny, would learning about those loans feel like a completely separate financial mistake, or would your mind immediately return to every previous moment when important information arrived too late? That question explains why the emotional reaction matters more than simply comparing dollar amounts, because people rarely experience trust problems as clean individual files stored separately in their memory. Once a major betrayal becomes part of a relationship, later surprises often arrive carrying emotional baggage from the first one, even when the circumstances are different. Now reverse the perspective, because Sumit's side also deserves more than a one-dimensional judgment. If you were Sumit, would you feel frustrated knowing one terrible decision from years earlier still influences how every new mistake gets interpreted, even after you completed the divorce, married Jenny, stood beside her through family opposition, and continued building a life with her? Redemption becomes difficult when history never stops entering the conversation, and Sumit has reasons to feel his present choices should not always be reduced to his worst choices from the past. Still, the problem becomes harder to dismiss when the same emotional theme keeps returning through different situations. The hidden marriage was one event, the uncertainty surrounding marriage paperwork was another, family pressure created another layer, and undisclosed loans brought money directly into the trust problem. These incidents do not carry equal seriousness, yet they keep circling the same uncomfortable issue because Jenny repeatedly finds herself dealing with major information after decisions have already moved forward. That pattern is where sympathy for Sumit meets accountability, because family pressure explains part of his behavior without removing Jenny's right to expect openness inside their marriage. A person caught between parents and a spouse faces genuine emotional pressure, especially when cultural expectations and family loyalty remain intense, but financial decisions still affect the partner sharing the consequences. Sumit's struggle deserves empathy, while Jenny's frustration deserves the same respect, and treating one person as completely right would flatten a relationship built on far more complicated choices. Then their wedding creates an important reversal, because Jenny and Sumit themselves kept their marriage from his disapproving parents when they finally decided to marry. That history proves secrecy does not automatically equal betrayal, because sometimes people withhold information to protect a decision from outside interference rather than to deceive the person directly affected by the decision. Jenny knew about the wedding, Sumit knew about the wedding, and the people being kept outside the decision were his parents, whose opposition had already shaped years of their relationship. That distinction changes the conversation because intent matters, consent matters, and the identity of the person left uninformed matters. Keeping a wedding from parents who oppose the relationship creates one kind of conflict, while keeping a marriage or substantial debt from the partner whose life is directly tied to those facts creates something far more personal. The word secret sounds identical in both situations, yet the emotional cost changes completely depending on who loses the chance to make an informed choice. And this is why the audience remains so divided about Jenny and Sumit, because their relationship contains enough evidence for both hope and skepticism. They have survived circumstances that would have ended many couples, and their affection has often looked genuine even during periods when their future seemed uncertain. At the same time, surviving a crisis does not automatically repair the behavior that created the crisis, especially when questions about disclosure continue appearing years after the original betrayal. Jenny and Sumit spent years proving relatives, critics, and skeptical viewers wrong simply by remaining together when almost everyone expected their relationship to collapse. That achievement carries emotional weight, but staying together only answers whether they endured the pressure surrounding them, while a harder question now sits inside the marriage itself. Proving outsiders wrong became part of their love story, yet proving each other right requires something more difficult, because after all these years, Jenny still needs confidence that the next major truth will reach her before the consequences do. If every major turning point in Jenny and Sumit's relationship were placed side by side like evidence, the pattern would look far more complicated than a simple story about one person being right and the other being wrong. The first fact still carries the heaviest emotional weight because Sumit kept his arranged marriage from Jenny while their relationship continued, leaving her to build plans around information she did not fully have. The decision created a trust wound so serious, later conflicts often get judged against the same history, even when the circumstances differ. Yet another fact belongs beside the first, because Sumit eventually completed the divorce, stayed committed to Jenny, and kept moving toward the future both of them had spent years fighting to reach. A fair reading of their history has to include change alongside failure, because Sumit eventually did what Jenny had been waiting for even though the road there stayed messy. Another trust problem surfaced when he canceled marriage paperwork without initially telling her, creating a familiar emotional pattern in which a major decision affecting their future moved ahead before Jenny fully understood what was happening. Sumit later reversed course, chose marriage, and married Jenny despite enormous resistance from his family, giving viewers another reason to believe his commitment was genuine even when his communication kept creating fresh damage. Many viewers expected marriage to calm the story because the largest legal obstacle had finally disappeared, yet family involvement remained close to the center and money gradually became another source of pressure. Jenny and Sumit had already spent years dealing with his parents' opposition, so new disagreements involving family carried old emotional weight from the moment they began. Their marriage no longer needed permission to exist, but competing loyalties still shaped decisions, and those pressures became harder to ignore once financial stability entered the conversation. The newest problem hit harder when Jenny learned Sumit had taken significant loans before telling her, because once again she was reacting after a serious decision had already moved forward. This sequence makes any easy verdict on Sumit difficult to defend, because 15 years of persistence, sacrifice, conflict, reconciliation, and shared life do not fit neatly inside the claim he never loved Jenny. He stayed through family rejection, pursued the divorce, eventually married her, and continued presenting the relationship as something worth protecting. Love appears throughout their story in ways viewers have seen for years. The sharper criticism sits somewhere else, because loving someone does not erase the damage created when major information reaches a spouse after decisions affecting both people have already been made. Jenny and Sumit have never lacked dramatic declarations, emotional promises, or proof both were willing to fight against outside pressure. Their recurring weakness appears when difficult information arrives late, especially when Sumit fears conflict, family consequences, or another emotional explosion. Delaying disclosure often postpones confrontation, but postponement changes the problem instead of removing the problem. By the time Jenny learns what happened, she is dealing with more than the original decision because she must process the choice itself and the realization her voice entered the process after the outcome had already started shaping their shared life. A serious marital reckoning would therefore need no fake witness, secret legal file, or dramatic courtroom confession to feel intense, because the strongest questions already sit inside their public history. Does Jenny learn about major financial decisions before they happen? Do Jenny and Sumit agree on boundaries when his parents become involved? Are choices affecting their future made together, or does one person decide first and explain later? When an apology comes, does behavior change enough to rebuild trust? Those questions cut through years of drama because each one asks whether Jenny feels like a partner during the decision instead of becoming the person informed after the consequences have already begun. Financial transparency carries special weight because money rarely stays confined to numbers once trust has already been damaged. A loan changes future options, creates repayment obligations, and adds pressure to a household. So telling a spouse afterward removes the chance to discuss risk before both people live with the result. Jenny's frustration, therefore, makes sense as more than anger over a dollar figure. If she believed they were confronting financial problems together, learning about substantial debt after the borrowing happened would make the conversation feel less like joint problem-solving and more like catching up with a decision she should have helped shape from the beginning. Family boundaries create another difficult layer because Sumit's parents have never been background figures in this relationship. Their opposition shaped years of his choices, and Sumit has often appeared torn between protecting Jenny and preserving some form of connection with his family. The conflict deserves empathy because family loyalty carries emotional weight, especially when cultural expectations and parental approval remain important. Still, marriage changes practical responsibilities. Parents are free to hold opinions, fears, and expectations, but a spouse should not become the last person to learn about decisions affecting shared money, housing, work, or future plans. Respect for parents loses its balance when marital communication keeps turning Jenny into the person who learns everything after the pressure has already landed. Sumit's sacrifices also belong on the table because accountability becomes weak when the story turns selective. He faced years of intense family resistance for staying with Jenny, completed a divorce carrying major emotional and financial consequences, and eventually married Jenny despite knowing the choice would deepen conflict with his parents. He has continued publicly expressing commitment to her, and in February 2026, he thanked Jenny for staying beside him while saying they intended to work through their difficulties together. Those public words matter because they show a man who still sees the marriage as worth protecting, even while serious problems inside the marriage remain unresolved. Jenny's sacrifices deserve equal weight because she never stood outside those battles waiting for Sumit to fix everything alone. She relocated, dealt with uncertainty over her future in India, tolerated years of family rejection, watched marriage plans stall, and continued choosing a relationship demanding far more patience than most people would expect to give. This history explains why divorce carries emotional gravity even as a hypothetical question. Leaving would mean more than walking away from one loan or one disagreement, because Jenny would also face the meaning of years spent fighting for a future she believed had finally become more secure. The danger begins when endurance starts doing work better communication should have done. A couple survives a crisis through love, attachment, sacrifice, fear of loss, or a shared refusal to let years of effort end in separation, but survival alone does not prove the source of conflict has been repaired. Jenny and Sumit have already demonstrated an extraordinary ability to remain together through pressure, yet the harder question asks whether their relationship learned enough from earlier crises to stop producing familiar emotional consequences through new situations. Staying together carries meaning, but staying together while the same trust problem keeps returning creates a different kind of concern. For this reason, the easiest judgments collapse under closer inspection. Saying Sumit never cared about Jenny ignores years of choices costing him family approval, money, comfort, and certainty. Saying Jenny should forget the past because they eventually married ignores how trust behaves after hidden information has already shaped major life decisions. Both positions erase half the evidence. Sumit has shown commitment while also making choices, leaving Jenny to learn serious information late. Jenny has shown forgiveness, while still retaining every right to expect stronger transparency after offering forgiveness. Their story stays compelling because both truths exist together instead of canceling each other out. The most revealing question is not whether Sumit loves Jenny enough, because his public actions give strong reasons to believe he does. The sharper question asks whether love has translated into a different decision-making process inside the marriage. Does he tell Jenny the difficult truth before fear pushes him towards silence? Does he involve her when money becomes complicated? Does he set boundaries with family before their involvement creates another conflict? Does he understand how each delayed disclosure now lands on top of memories created years earlier? Those changes matter more than another emotional promise because Jenny has already heard promises and stayed through crises testing far more than ordinary patience. Jenny's side carries its own challenge because forgiveness needs boundaries if trust is supposed to recover. Forgiving Sumit for the hidden marriage never required her to pretend the deception disappeared from memory, and remaining married does not require acceptance of every future surprise as part of the relationship's personality. She remains able to value his sacrifices while demanding financial honesty, understand his family pressure while expecting protection for their shared decisions, and recognize the years he spent choosing her while still asking whether those choices are matched by openness now. Such balance carries more emotional truth than either immediate separation or unlimited forgiveness. Once all those moments sit beside one another, the courtroom premise turns back on itself and becomes less about whether Jenny has enough emotional evidence to leave. The more revealing question concerns what Sumit needs to change, so leaving never becomes an option, she starts weighing seriously. Their history already contains warning signs, second chances, sacrifices, reversals, and years of commitment from both sides. The uncertain part is whether Sumit has fully absorbed the lesson connecting so many of their hardest moments. Jenny has spent years proving she will stand beside him when the truth hurts, but after everything they have survived, she should not still be the person waiting for the truth to arrive. After everything Jenny has survived with Sumit, the quietest question feels heavier than any dramatic confrontation because she has already proven how far she is willing to go for this relationship. She forgave the catfishing that started their connection under false pretenses, returned after learning about the arranged marriage, waited while Sumit worked through the divorce process, endured years of rejection from his family, and eventually married the man she had spent so long defending. When you place those choices together, Jenny does not look like someone who runs when relationships become difficult, which is why another trust problem carries so much emotional weight. Jenny has already given this relationship more second chances than most couples ever face, yet the strange part is how trust still keeps returning as one of their biggest concerns. The circumstances change, the stakes shift, and the people involved move around, but Jenny repeatedly ends up asking questions after something important has already happened. Years ago, the shock centered on Sumit being married to someone else, while the latest conflict centers on loans and financial decisions. Yet both situations leave Jenny confronting information she wishes she had received earlier. That difference matters because surviving a crisis and repairing the behavior behind a crisis are not the same achievement. Jenny and Sumit have proven they possess enormous endurance, and nobody watching their story over the years should dismiss the effort required to stay together through family battles, legal problems, money stress, cultural pressure, and constant uncertainty. Endurance kept them together, but healthy repair asks a harder question about whether both people changed how they handle the next difficult decision after the previous one caused pain. Jenny's history suggests she believes relationships deserve room for forgiveness, especially when she sees genuine effort afterward. She watched Sumit eventually complete his divorce, continue resisting family pressure, and marry her despite knowing his parents strongly opposed their relationship. Those choices gave Jenny reasons to believe the sacrifices were leading somewhere meaningful, because Sumit was no longer offering only promises about a shared future. He was taking steps toward the life they had discussed for years. That history also explains why the financial revelation hurts, without automatically proving the marriage is finished. Jenny has reasons to care deeply about Sumit, and Sumit has years of choices, showing Jenny occupies a major place in his life. Their affection has never been the missing ingredient, and their willingness to fight for each other has remained one of the strongest parts of their story. The issue sitting between them now is whether affection is enough when important decisions keep reaching Jenny after the fact. Love often gets celebrated through dramatic sacrifices because those moments are easy to recognize. Moving countries looks enormous, standing against family pressure looks enormous, waiting through a divorce looks enormous, and getting married after years of opposition feels like a clear victory. Communication works differently because viewers rarely notice the healthy version. Nobody creates a huge dramatic moment because two spouses discussed alone before signing the papers, yet those ordinary conversations often protect a marriage more effectively than another emotional declaration after trust has already taken a hit. That is where Jenny and Sumit's story becomes uncomfortable because their biggest victories have been public, while some of their hardest problems involve basic private partnership. They defeated the obvious obstacles people kept placing in front of them, but marriage creates smaller decisions every day where there is no outside villain to blame. Family pressure matters, financial stress matters, and cultural expectations matter, yet Jenny and Sumit still have to decide whether difficult information gets shared before a choice becomes a consequence. The hardest question for Jenny is therefore not whether she loves Sumit enough to forgive him again, because her history already answers how deeply she cares about him. The harder question asks how many second chances love should require before the next chance comes with firmer conditions. Forgiveness without change starts losing its meaning because the person offering forgiveness eventually needs evidence that their pain altered something about how future decisions are handled. That does not mean Jenny needs to punish Sumit forever for mistakes from years ago, because holding every old failure over someone indefinitely creates its own unhealthy pattern. Sumit should have room to prove growth through present behavior, especially after completing the divorce and building a marriage with Jenny despite serious family opposition. Yet growth is measured through repeated choices, and the loan revelation gives Jenny a fair reason to ask whether financial honesty has become strong enough for the future they are trying to maintain. Fan reactions reflect the same tension because viewers do not seem united around one clean interpretation of this couple. Some remain suspicious of Sumit's explanations after learning about the loans, especially because the revelation fits too easily beside earlier examples where Jenny discovered important information later than she wanted. Other viewers remain protective of the relationship because they see two people who have survived more outside pressure than almost anyone else in the franchise, while still showing affection and commitment toward each other. Both reactions make sense when the full history stays in view. Skeptical viewers see repetition and worry that Jenny keeps forgiving behavior before enough changes. Supportive viewers see persistence and argue that couples who survive 15 years of turmoil deserve more credit than a single financial conflict erases. The disagreement becomes interesting because neither side needs to pretend the other is foolish. Jenny and Sumit have produced enough evidence for hope and concern to exist at the same time. The hidden marriage remains the emotional reference point even though its legal relevance ended once Sumit's divorce became final. That chapter belongs to the past in practical terms, but emotional memory does not follow legal paperwork. When someone learns a truth capable of changing their entire future, later surprises often get measured against the first betrayal because the earlier experience taught them what missing information feels like. Jenny, therefore, does not need to consciously compare every disagreement with the former marriage for the history to matter. A delayed disclosure around money still carries extra weight because she knows what happened the last time major information sat outside her awareness. She knows what it feels like to believe she understands the relationship while another reality exists beside the one she sees, and that memory changes how easily reassurance lands when another unexpected truth appears. Sumit faces the opposite challenge because living under permanent suspicion would also make progress difficult. If every mistake becomes proof he is still the same person who hid his marriage, then genuine growth becomes almost impossible to recognize. He completed the divorce, married Jenny, continued choosing her through family opposition, and publicly expressed commitment to staying together through current difficulties, so those actions deserve space beside his failures. The balance sits in what happens before the next crisis, rather than what either person says after the current one. Sumit does not need another grand gesture to prove he cares about Jenny as much as he needs consistent openness around decisions affecting their shared life. Jenny does not need to forget the past to move forward, but she needs enough present evidence to stop expecting another uncomfortable surprise whenever money, family, or major plans enter the conversation. Their parents remain part of the pressure because Sumit's relationship with his family has shaped nearly every chapter of the story. Jenny spent years feeling rejected by people whose approval Sumit still wanted, while Sumit repeatedly tried to balance loyalty toward Jenny with emotional ties to his parents. That conflict has never disappeared completely, and financial strain makes boundaries even more important because family decisions become harder when money and obligations start overlapping. This is where the loans become more interesting than the number itself. $15,000, $20,000, or any similar amount creates obvious financial pressure, but the larger question concerns why Sumit felt comfortable making those decisions without bringing Jenny into the conversation first. Was he trying to solve a problem before worrying her? Was family pressure shaping his judgment? Or had both of them fallen into a pattern where Sumit handles difficult situations privately until hiding them becomes impossible? The public information does not give enough evidence to assign a private motive with confidence, and inventing one would make the story less fair instead of more dramatic. What viewers do know is that Jenny learned about substantial loans after Sumit had already taken them, and that sequence matters because financial trust depends heavily on timing. Hearing about debt before borrowing creates a discussion, while hearing about debt afterward creates a reaction. Jenny has spent years reacting to circumstances she did not fully control, which makes this latest chapter feel especially frustrating. She reacted to discovering the marriage, reacted to Sumit's family opposition, reacted to changes around their wedding plans, and now reacts to financial decisions already made. At some point, being included earlier becomes more important than hearing another explanation later because partnership requires participation before the outcome has been decided. Still, predicting divorce from this conflict would ignore everything else their history tells us. Jenny has repeatedly stayed when outsiders expected her to leave, and Sumit has repeatedly found ways back toward the relationship after pressure pushed him in another direction. Their marriage has survived events far more explosive than a single financial disclosure, which makes certainty about their future impossible without inventing an ending neither of them has publicly announced. The more meaningful question concerns what surviving this latest crisis would look like. Staying married would only settle one part of the issue because the larger victory would involve changing how future decisions happen. Jenny would need confidence that financial choices are discussed openly. Sumit would need room to communicate problems without expecting every difficult conversation to become a replay of old betrayals, and both would need stronger boundaries around outside family pressure whenever shared money or plans are involved. That kind of change would make their history feel less like a loop and more like something they learned from. The hidden marriage would remain part of their past, but it would stop functioning as the emotional template for every new surprise. The loans would become a painful turning point rather than another chapter in the same pattern, and Jenny would finally have a reason to believe difficult information reaches her before the consequences do. If that change does not happen, the problem grows larger than any one loan because every future surprise starts carrying extra history. An unexplained payment feels heavier, a delayed conversation creates more suspicion, and another family decision becomes harder to separate from everything Jenny already forgave. Trust becomes expensive when each repair has to cover damage from the present and echoes from the past at the same time. Jenny and Sumit have spent years proving their relationship survives pressure from outside, but their next challenge sits much closer to home. They no longer need to convince skeptical relatives, viewers, or anyone else that their feelings are serious because 15 years together already answer that question better than another speech ever would. What needs proof now is whether the marriage has learned how to handle truth before truth becomes another crisis. And that leaves one question hanging over everything Jenny has endured since the first secret changed her life. If she and Sumit move past the loans and stay together, will this finally become the moment when major decisions start happening as partners? Or will another undisclosed choice eventually reopen every wound they thought they had already survived? Because the next part of their story is no longer about whether Jenny loves Sumit enough to stay. The more revealing mystery sits inside those loans, where the money went, why Jenny learned so late, and how family obligations might explain why their financial problems became another test of trust.